r/AskReddit. What's the biggest double life you've ever personally seen revealed? Our family cat was outside one night and I see my cat walking directly towards my neighbor's house, and then I see their front door open. Walks directly inside like she'd done it a million times. She was outside quite a bit, so we assumed she was outside doing cat stuff. Nope. Little kitty was just at home. Number 2. We had a guy in high school who faked a deep voice for the 7 years we've known him, and senior year he revealed that it wasn't his real voice. Edit. Typically kids in high school also went to middle school with the same people. I know a guy who faked cancer, but when he traveled to a town an hour or so away for his chemo he was really testing children. He worked for a car rental company and got them to comp him rentals to go for his treatments. Oh, and he had a few of us almost convinced that his landlord was a child molester, and the actual reason their home had that very phrase spray painted on it by parties unknown. So yeah, the diddler who faked cancer to enable his child molestation and CP production would have to be the craziest double life of anyone I've known. A well-respected family of 2 teachers with 2 cute kids, the husband at the high school and the wife at the elementary school in the fairly high-income town they lived in. Turns out the wife was dealing drugs without husband knowing. Got busted at school. Cops showed up to elementary and high school. Lost her job and they got divorced. She moved away. Guy I used to work with. He lived in a small country town with his wife and 3 kids. When he was fired from his job, where I worked, he could only find something at his level in the big city 2 hours away. So he would go to work in the city Monday to Friday, and home to his wife and kids on the weekends. This went on for years. It came out about 5 years into the arrangement that he wasn't living in the small crappy city apartment as he said. He was living with his girlfriend and their 2 kids. So he had a wife and 3 kids, and a girlfriend with 2 kids, all his. Apparently the girlfriend knew about the wife, but the wife had no idea about the girlfriend, and his 3 country kids had 2 younger siblings that they knew nothing about. It of course blew up spectacularly. The wife kicked him out and he went to live with the girlfriend. 6 months later she was sick of him and kicked him to the curb too. So now he pays child support for 5 kids to 2 different women and is actually living in that small crappy apartment. I worked with this guy once who was known for his stories. No matter how loose the connection was, he'd find a way to turn anything into a personal anecdote of a thing he'd seen or done before. All of them were interesting the first time. He'd lived an interesting life, grown up in America, moved to Australia in his early 20s, worked in a lot of really cool places over the years. But it wasn't long before he started repeating the same stories over and over again. I worked with him for just over 3 years, so it got pretty ridiculous. We knew how he met his wife, all the obscure things he owned, his pets, his kids. We knew every detail of his life. It became a bit of an in-joke within the office about how the guy never shut up. Then one day, he didn't come in. He'd died of a heart attack. The whole office was at a loss, especially our little department, which had about 8 people in it, including him. When it came to his funeral, our little group took the afternoon off and attended. And that's how we found out none of his stories were true. He'd grown up locally. His family wasn't at all who we thought they were. None of his old jobs had happened. Everything we known about him had just been made up. The most interesting thing for me was that at one point, our boss needed someone to head to China to double check something in person at one of our company's factories. When the usual choices couldn't do it, he was picked. It seemed like a no-brainer, since he was regularly going to and from America to visit family and had traveled a lot on his other jobs. We now think that may have been his first time overseas. Not really revealed because it was always in the open, but my parents' friend has the weirdest double life situation I've ever seen. Paul was married to Clarissa for 12 years, and they had a son together. However, Paul and Clarissa break up, and Paul moves out. Shortly after, Paul starts dating Jenny. Shortly after Jenny gets pregnant, Paul realizes he misses Clarissa, and somehow talks Jenny and Clarissa into sharing him. Then, a few years later, Paul adds Renee to the mix. I should throw in these are decent looking women with jobs, and Paul himself is no Rich Adonis either. So, Paul has a wife and 2 girlfriends. They each have their own house on the same street, and their own individual family lives. Paul spends the night with a different one each night, and they trade holidays. The women aren't romantically involved and they barely interact, so it's not like a poly relationship or even a sister-wife deal. How he pulled this off and how they make it work is beyond me, but it's been years now. I served in the Navy from 1985 to 2005, while in my first squadron, from 1985 to 1989. We were away from home often, either on short detachments of 2 5-week or 6-month deployments. During one period when we were at home for a while, I was on watch in the duty office after hours. Me and another guy just had to man the office, answer the phone, and monitor the guys on watch down in the hangar bay. Shortly after our watch started, we got a phone call from a wife of someone in our squadron. She was asking us when the squadron would be back from detachment. I asked the other guy if he knew about anybody out on DET, and he just looked at me funny. I told her we didn't currently have anyone on DET, we've all been back home for a couple months. She insisted her husband had been out on DET for 3 weeks and needed to know when he was coming home. I assured her nobody was on DET, and told her I had seen her husband earlier that day at work. She just hung up after that. Turns out, the guy was telling his wife he was out on DET and shacking up with his girlfriend for a few weeks. She called the commanding officer to find out when her husband had been part of a detachment and found out he'd done it many times over the previous couple years. Infidelity is officially against the Uniform Code of Military Justice. It didn't turn out well for him. I worked at Victoria's Secret for quite a few years. I saw a lot of shady shit, but the worst was an encounter over holiday season. Guy comes up with some XC lingerie and some nice flannel pajamas. Asks them to be bagged separately and for separate gift receipts in the bag. Easy enough for the new cashier I'm training, I think, so I leave to assign breaks. Few days later he comes back raging. Just screaming and cussing everyone out. Turns out the new cashier mixed the gift receipts up. Wife found out about mistress. There really was no fixing that situation considering the dude was just a prick in general, and I had no desire to make the situation right, so I just called security and went about my day. So when I first left home in my late teens, I shared a big house, I think 6+ bedrooms, with a close friend, his brother and some other randoms. Think frat house except no college university. Splitting the expenses worked out pretty well. So one of the guys worked at a port in customs or something. He had a uniform and did etc. Left for work at the same time every morning and hung out with us after work. He was always down for attending social events with us and most of us liked him. Fast forward about a year and he starts telling us about how he can get us discounted TVs and other merchandise from the port. Unclaimed seized property that apparently no one sweats about if just a few items go astray. Everyone gave it a pass as it seemed sketchy. Then one day we come home to one of our housemates in shock and bawling like a baby. Turns out not only did he give the guy his life savings, he also gave him money borrowed from his dad. The customs guy had said he could get him a new car cheap. The long con. Turns out the guy doesn't work at the port. The name he gave us doesn't exist and we have no idea how he spent his days or came up with his share of the rent bills. Still creeps me out a little knowing I lived with a stranger for so long. Earlier this year I learned my dad has been addicted to heroin and stolen many expensive things from various members of my family. I knew that people had been getting things stolen from them but never even began to think it was my dad. He did get help and is now 5 months clean, but still working and building up my family's trust again. Fellow grad student has 2 young kids, one that is struggling to walk and communicate and is in the process of being diagnosed. She is pulling 10-16 hour days between interning and classes, plus being a mom and wife. She gets a call from a friend that expresses how excited she is to see her at the husband's work party. What? She didn't RSVP, and her husband said he would pop over for less than an hour then come home to be with her for a quiet dinner. Turns out he was bringing a date that wasn't her. They had been seeing each other for about 6 months and even had taken a trip together under the pretense of a business trip. Anytime he had been late or gone, we assumed he was with her. Friend did her a solid and took a couple pics for the divorce lawyer. My grandmother passed away a couple years ago. While going through her house, my family found a box with my grandfather's name on it in his handwriting. My grandfather died before I was born. It was taped closed and the dust on it suggested it hadn't ever been opened. Inside, my family found newspaper clippings and other documents. Turns out that in the early 1900s, My grandfather took a road trip with friends to see the ocean. During their time at the beach, their car was stolen. They decided to stay a while. Being in their late teens and out of school, they decided to earn some money and have a good time. My grandfather met a Mexican girl and married her within the course of a month. There was an article on the vehicle theft, as well as another on the marriage and a marriage certificate. We could never find information on what happened next. We don't even rightly know if they married for love, to get her citizenship, if they had kids, or even if he was legally divorced when he married my grandmother in the 1930s. We don't think my grandmother knew. We did find out his first wife returned to Mexico. She did have children, who say they don't think their mom had kids before she remarried. We sent them copies of the documents we found and they were as flabbergasted as we were. Ducking like and subscribe.